Here we talk about Alfred Marshall, who is, along with Leon Walras, is basically the person who has influenced the type of economics that you would learn in a principles course. So he's one of the co-founders of neoclassical economics, which is the dominant paradigm that you encounter today when you take principles. And he is quite influential in the discipline, not only because he um, wrote one of the best-selling textbooks in economics, Principles of Economics, in 1890, and it kind of popularized terms like Giffen good, and you get your first instance where the demand curve is downward sloping and supply curve upward sloping, and that kind of graphical discussion. But the other reason he's important is because the economists that followed him, that were influenced by him, would also go on to their own notoriety. Most notably, individuals like Keynes, Pigou, Joan Robinson. Now, one of the things that kind of denotes Marshall as a person is that he didn't use a lot of math. So he tended to focus on economics as having these laws. And we see that today, right? We see that there's a law of diminishing marginal utility. We see that there's a law of demand, law of supply. We see these things. And then we also, with Marshall, we see that use of the ceteris paribus assumption. Because what he's trying to do is make economics like a science, right? Where you could hold various variables constant and then see how things adjust. Marshall himself was a person who, although again originally trained as a mathematician, he read Mills's Principles on Political Economy and kind of basically switched over to economics. Now Marshall, unlike some of the previous economists, he really was focused on the poor and how to make their lives better. And he saw economics as one of the vehicles to doing that, to being able to achieve that. It took a long time to write his textbook. Yes, I mean, it was popular for basically 50 years after he finally published it in 1890. But he had started it 23 years previously. He started it in 1867. He then, with the manuscripts of his textbook, tested them out in the classroom, and obviously refined the book and whatnot. But his idea was that he would write a good textbook that would be, and it would be a course that students would take. Not economic students necessarily, but let's say sociologists, education majors and whatnot. All these individuals in the university would take, and then those individuals would take those skills and they would go out into the world and help to combat poverty. As I said, the textbook becomes quite useful because it is the first time, again, we see a demand graph, we see a supply graph, we even see the PPF, and so we see the first instances of the kind of textbook that you would see today. So in the textbook, in the Principles textbook, what he does is he takes a very broad view of economics. And this is much like Mill, so obviously Mill being the influence for him. But when he talks about principles, right, we're kind of talking about very basic, very broad notions of economic thought. And look at this quote, right? I mean, here's where you really see it. Here, political economy or economics is a study of mankind in the ordinary business of life. It examines that part of individual or social action which is most closely connected with the attainment and the use of the material requisites of well-being. And that's a bit different than what we would see, when you take your first day of economics. They probably focus on that idea that economics is a science of scarcity, and they kind of just go along with that. But right for Marshall, again, the things are a bit more broad, and that broadness is, again, looking at why people do certain things, that part of the individual or social action which is closely connected to people satisfying their interests. Now, what this also means is that, which makes it a little bit different, is that for Marshall, he's going to focus on the normative questions, again, the questions of like what ought to be. Not too surprising given his focus on social reform. But then the other part of this would be that the economics itself was considered quite broad and not too dissimilar from other social sciences like political science, sociology, psychology, or even history. So there's no intention on Marshall to, there's no intention of Marshall to make the discipline of economics seem superior to other disciplines. Rather, it's to make economics seem just like other disciplines in terms of the goal that they're trying to seek. And so we don't see that today. I mean, today, if we look around at the discipline of economics, what we see are economists not considering economics as a broad field, and that they are drawing these sharp boundaries to distinguish what is appropriately an economics question versus a question that should be answered by a different discipline. Whether economics then deals with social issues, his sense was that I guess it just depends on what the economist wants to do. Marshall, despite being a mathematician, didn't use it a lot in economics. He would push things to footnotes, the math to footnotes, if at all possible, and he didn't care for it. What he did care a bit more about was history. So in some sense, Marshall is influenced by the British historicists at the time, and he felt that, just as other historicists do, he felt that the economic models on their own, as they were constructed at that moment in time, were too static. That they should incorporate historical change, and that historical change is what gives development some evolutionary trajectory. That institutions develop and they slowly develop over time, and that these developments of these institutions are based on customs, they're based on the aptitudes of the people. We get with Marshall this first instance again of ceteris paribus, which again you would cover in a typical principles class, but again it's like holding everything else equal, right? Holding everything else constant. And that based on that, what we get then with Marshall is this focus on looking at how a discipline can, like economics, can try to predict what will happen in the future based on certain events changing, which is basically the essence of partial equilibrium analysis. Partial equilibrium analysis being how does the equilibrium price or quantity change when some different event happens. Now, Marshall doesn't believe that economics on its own will be able to talk about all that's happening in reality. Rather, economic theory is just that first approximation. It's a first guess at what the impact will be from a change occurring. The economist, for Marshall at least, should be broadly trained. And the broader training that they have, the more skeptical they'll be that economics has, all the answers. Marshall was a bit of a collector of different, economic theories. So he wasn't necessarily he wasn't going to just push a single type of economic thought. And he felt that economists can kind of pick and choose what theories of economic thought whatever theories they wanted in order to answer whatever questions were, out there. The problem is that because Marshall wasn't a strong supporter of one particular view, at least in those earlier years, he could be forgotten because he could be seen as kind of just moving whatever way the winds are blowing. From Marshall as well, we get the Marshallian cross. And in the Marshallian cross, what we're seeing here is this idea where we focus on marginal utility. And that in looking at the marginal utility of a product, we can determine what the price of the product will be. So mathematically, it makes a bit sense, right? That we can understand that people will only buy the good to the extent that they have a marginal benefit to consuming the good. And what's interesting is that, again, he's writing this book starting in 1867. He's coming up with these ideas before Jevons, Menger, and Walras are doing those ideas in the 1870s. So even though his textbook doesn't come out until 1890, he's already working on the ideas long before, well, at least before, not long before, but he's working on them before the utilitarians are working on them, which we looked at in the 1870s. When we go back to the idea then of how are the prices being determined, the prices are being determined, it doesn't really matter whether it's supply that's more important or demand that's more important. Really, it's the interaction between the two and the relevant time period that we're talking about. Just to talk about only one curve, supply or demand, would be kind of missing the bigger picture that there's this interaction, these forces of interaction that are causing the price to change. And in talking a little bit more about what is it that causes or determines the price and whether it's supply or demand, Marshall focuses on the fact that in some sense it doesn't really even matter, right? And he uses this example, which I think is kind of interesting, but he uses this example where, what is it, he uses this analogy of, when you're cutting something with scissors, is it the top part of the blade or the bottom part of the blade that's doing the cutting? Well, I mean, in some sense, who cares, right? The fact of the matter is that it's being cut. One of the blades may be not moving at all and the other blade moving, but, they're both playing a role in doing that cutting. And that's kind of what's going on here. And so Marshall's putting, again, all these theories together. And so he writes in book 3, he writes, he gets a chance to talk a little bit more about what his theory of demand is and how it's linked to people seeking to maximize their marginal utility. And he credits Jevons for that focus on the marginal utility, but again, he was coming up with it before even Jevons wrote what he wrote. And so this part, it's not very different from what you've seen in Principles, where I have an additive utility function where these utilities are cardinal, and we understand that total utility is simply the summation of individual goods and the utility that they generate. and that this marginal utility over time decreases. And again, Marshall, because of the way he's thinking, again, there are laws in place. So this would be our law of diminishing marginal utility, or what Marshall calls Gossen's first law. Then in Gossen's second law, that Marshall is going to talk about, would be that the ratio of the marginal utility to the price is equal across all goods. So essentially, if something costs 3 times as much, it should deliver 3 times as much marginal utility or additional happiness. And what that leads Marshall to is his first statement of the law of demand, that as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. And as the quantity demanded rises, what we would see is that the marginal utility is falling. So then the consumer would be less willing to pay for that good. And there's our link between the price and the quantity. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second. And so what we see in Marshall also for the first time, and something that you, again, see when you do, when you take a principles course, is that you get a actual graph for the demand curve, and you get a table where it lists various prices and quantity. And you get this sense that the demand curve has several variables affecting how much quantity is consumed, and that description is what we get with Marshall. Now, there's just a lot of attention on this, and I don't think it's always appropriate. So if I go over this a little bit fast, it's just because I'm not sure how important it is. And that would be the Giffen good. Do you remember the Giffen good? The Giffen good is the good where it's upward sloping demand curve, which obviously is a little bit crazy. But what Marshall did is he looked back at history and he saw that, even before that, when he was talking about his law of demand, he was saying that there was an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. But that he then recalled that historically, an economist named Robert Giffen had found that there was an instance where the price and the quantity demanded moved in the same direction. And so Marshall mentions this because it obviously is an exception to the law of demand. And the example that he used here was partly Irish potato famine, and he talked about bread being kind of a staple in the diet of the working class, yet that as people became poorer, they were eating more bread. Or in the Irish potato famine example, that as the Irish potato famine was occurring, the price was going up, yet people were buying more of it. And this is what Marshall wrote about Giffen. That basically Marshall describes his law of demand, and then he says, this exception is what Giffen pointed out. And in essence, the only way to get an upward sloping demand curve is that in this case there was a rise in the price of bread that made so large a drain on the resources of the poor laboring families that they were forced to curtail their consumption of meat and more expensive foods, and then they still just bought more bread because it was the cheapest thing that they could still buy. So basically, though, Marshall says this is a really extreme example. For the most part, we're going to focus on demand curves that are downward sloping. And so that's just what we see here. I'm not going to give you more detail here than you need. For whatever reason, textbooks to this day still focus more on the Giffen good than I think that they should. Marshall himself doesn't really give a good explanation for the Giffen good and why that exception exists. If you take intermediate microeconomics, we do focus maybe about half a lecture or a quarter of a lecture on the Giffen good. And basically today, economists summarize it as the income effect being so strong that it overwhelms the substitution effect, thus causing the demand curve to go upward sloping. That essentially a Giffen good is a really, really, really inferior good. A normal inferior good is one where the income goes up and people buy less of it. And that would be because, again, the income effect works in the slight opposite direction of the substitution effect, but the substitution effect is still stronger. For the Giffen good, again, the income effect is working the opposite direction of the substitution effect, and it is larger than the substitution effect. But probably besides the textbook, the other big contribution of Marshall to modern economic thought is his discussion of price elasticity of demand. And what this is focused on is the sensitivity of the quantity demanded to changes in price. And that as you essentially, let's say, change the price by 1%, you get a greater than 1% change in the quantity, 1% change in the quantity, or less than 1% change in the quantity. With elasticity meaning you're getting a greater than 1%, and inelasticity meaning it's a less than 1%. And so that's what we see right here. That the elasticity equation, again, is this ratio of percentages. Percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. And it's always negative because the demand curve is downward sloping. We're talking about sensitivity here, or as the third bullet point indicates, responsiveness. Where again, our difference is that in terms of the elasticity of demand, if the price changes 1% and the quantity changes more than 1%, it is elastic. If the price changes 1% and it's a less than 1% change in the quantity, it is then inelastic. The last big thing that Marshall gives us is this notion of consumer surplus. And what we're talking about here is that Marshall emphasizes for us that there's this difference between what a person is actually paying and how much they would have been willing to pay, because that's part of his definition of demand. So while the demand curve captures a willingness to pay, he acknowledges that the equilibrium price might be less, and if that difference between the two would be the amount of the consumer surplus. And we see that right here, right, where the demand curve is capturing everyone's reservation price, their maximum willingness to pay. But if they're actually paying the equilibrium price, these people are all going to feel like they got a good deal, that they would have been willing to pay more, but they didn't have to. And then Marshall starts to talk about a fiction here, an analytical fiction, that he calls the representative firm. Because in his analysis, he wants to have a discussion of why firms exist and what do they do under two different levels of competition. The one being perfect competition and the other being the monopoly. Which, again, when you take a Principles of Microeconomics course, typically, right, you start with perfect competition and then the next chapter is monopoly, right? And we talk about how prices and quantities are determined under those competitive structures, which is what Marshall did. And that when we're talking about how firms make decisions, that we focus on different time periods. One where the one of the inputs is fixed, usually it's capital, and that would be in short run. And then we look at the long run, where both of the inputs in the production process are variable. And then we divide up the costs structure for the firm into fixed costs that don't change on the basis of quantity, and variable costs, which do change based on how much is being produced. I mean, look at that. That isn't very different than how we teach principles of economics today. All goes back to Marshall in his approach. And so then what Marshall does for us is he focuses on the short run versus long run notion of costs to be able to trace out when is it that a firm will shut down completely. That would be when prices are less than the average variable costs, and that the rest of the supply curve for the firm is determined by the variable cost curve. In the long run, what we know is that the fixed costs must be covered. So eventually we have to cover the fixed costs. And so that would mean that in the long run, the supply curve is the total cost curve, as opposed to just the variable cost curve. And that when we talk about things like that, what we need to talk about are these notions of what kind of scale do we have for the firm. In other words, do we have increasing returns to scale, constant returns to scale, or decreasing returns to scale? And what that refers to is, when I increase my number of inputs, do I get double my outputs, less than double my outputs? What's my ratio of changing inputs to outputs? Marshall believed that in the long run, essentially, there would be a tendency for the returns to scale to increase. And so he kind of sees this for us here as a possible notion of how things are going to change. And so that gives us an idea of the internal economies of scale. And then there's external economies of scale that can exist as these other things change, such as your location, or maybe building other industries. And so this, interestingly enough, this is taken from his actual textbook. I just kind of scanned this in. This is what his supply curves look like. A little bit different than what we're seeing here, but for the firms, the various firms, this is how Marshall described these supply curves existing on the basis of how firms act. And so for Marshall, a lot of this depends on, again, the way in which these firms are deciding, or what's being determined for them as their scales of production, and that in terms of the scale of production and the costs, such that the total project curve is a mirror image of the total cost curve. And so there we get our Marshallian cross, where demand intersects supply, and the market all goes back to the equilibrium. Direct from Marshall here. Okay, so then he's got this description of equilibrium, which I'm not going to read, but you get, direct from Marshall here, you get our first notion of what the consumer surplus and the producer surplus looks like. Again, not that different than what you see in a textbook today. And so then as we kind of bring this all to a close, what we get is Marshall then describing for us why competition is so important. And that what competition does is it helps us get to this equilibrium, and that it encourages businesses to act in as efficient of a way as possible. And the last part of this, in the 1890s, which is also important here too, because we see, at least in the United States, that it becomes the fight against monopolies becomes a lot more important, and that's that monopolies and oligopolies are basically not good things. That you want there to be this competition in order to achieve the lowest costs. Okay.